Steve and I met when I was just 20. He smiled a lot, he knew what to say, and he made me feel seen. I didn't have much in life back then. No car, no house, just dreams. He said, "Let's build a life together." And I believed him. We got married after 6 months. It felt fast, but I didn't care. I wanted to be loved. I wanted a family. I thought love would fix everything. The early days were quiet. We moved into a small apartment. Steve worked part-time and I worked at a clothing shop. We didn't have much money, but I was happy. I cooked simple meals. I washed our clothes by hand. I dreamed of a big family, and soon we had one. First came Ellie, then Max, then Grace, and finally little Leo. 4 children, 4 reasons to smile. They were loud, messy, and full of love. Every day was busy. I made breakfast, packed lunches, walked them to school. I held their hands, kissed their foreheads, and gave them everything I had. But Steve gave less and less. At first, he came home late and said he was working. Then he started sleeping during the day. Then he stopped working at all. He stayed in bed most mornings, watched TV, played games on his phone, and said he was tired. I asked, "Can you help with the kids?" He replied, "I worked all those years. Let me rest now." I wanted to shout, "That was years ago," but I stayed quiet. He didn't speak to the children much. When he did, it was to complain. If Ellie spilled her juice, he shouted. If Max asked too many questions, he told him to shut up. Grace was scared of him. Leo cried when Steve walked into the room. I started doing everything alone. I woke up early, I made breakfast, I got the children ready, I walked them to school. I worked all day. Then I came home, made dinner, helped with homework, gave baths, cleaned dishes, and put them to sleep. Steve watched me do it all. He never helped. He never asked how I was. Once I said, "I'm really tired today." He looked at me and said, "You chose this life," then turned back to the TV. One night, I burned the food. I was holding Leo in one arm and cooking with the other. The rice stuck to the bottom of the pot. The smell was bad. Steve walked into the kitchen, looked at the food, and said, "You can't even cook right?" Then he threw the pot in the sink and left the room. I wanted to cry, but Leo was still in my arms. Some nights I sat on the bathroom floor just to cry. I didn't want the kids to see. I didn't want to scare them. I put a towel in front of my mouth so no one could hear me. I cried until I felt empty. Then I washed my face and tucked Leo back into bed. I stayed, not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know what else to do. We didn't have money for 2 homes. I had no car, no family near me, no friend who could take in a mother and 4 kids. I felt stuck. Still, I told myself, at least they have a father. But even that wasn't true. Steve didn't act like a father. He was just there, sitting in the house like a shadow, cold, silent, angry, watching us like we were strangers. One day, Max came home from school with a drawing. It was our family. He had drawn me, Ellie, Grace, Leo, and himself. Steve wasn't in the picture. I asked, "Where's Dad?" He said, "He doesn't come with us. He stays on the couch." That night, I couldn't sleep. I started to see what I had been hiding from. The children were not happy. They were scared, quiet, careful around him. They asked me for everything, never him. One Saturday, Ellie dropped a bowl in the kitchen. It broke. The sound was loud. Steve rushed in and shouted, "Are you stupid?" She froze. She was only 9. I stepped in and said, "She's a child, Steve." He turned to me, eyes full of rage. "Don't talk to me like that." I stood my ground. "Don't talk to her like that." He walked out and slammed the door. The kids didn't move. I held Ellie and whispered, "It's okay, you're safe." But I knew she wasn't. Not really. Another day, Grace needed new shoes. Hers were too small. I told Steve, "She needs new ones. Her toes are hurting." He said, "So go buy them. Why are you telling me?" I said, "We don't have enough money this week." He looked at me and said, "Then tell her to stop growing." That night, Grace cried herself to sleep. I felt so small, so helpless. One morning, I got up and my back hurt badly. I had worked a long shift the day before. I couldn't even bend down to pick up Leo. Steve saw me and said, "You walk like an old woman." I said, "My back hurts." He laughed and said, "Maybe it's from all that talking you do." Later that week, Grace asked, "Mom, why don't you leave?" I froze. I looked at her. She was only 7. "What do you mean?" I asked. She looked down and said, "Because Dad doesn't like us." I felt like my heart broke too. Steve asked me why dinner was late that day. I didn't answer. I just looked at him. I saw a man who once said he loved me, but there was no love left in his eyes. Not for me. Not for the kids. Not for anyone. He said, "You're quiet now." I said, "I'm thinking." He said, "Good. You talk too much anyway." Then he walked away. I wanted to pack a bag and leave. I wanted to take the kids and run. But where? How? I had 4 children. I had no savings. I was scared. Still, something changed in me that day. I no longer believed the lie that staying was good for the kids. They weren't safe. They weren't happy. And neither was I. But leaving would take time. I needed a plan, a way to save money, a place to go. Before I share the rest of my story, I need to know, where are you listening from? Knowing someone hears me, understands me, gives me strength. So for now, I stayed, but in my heart, I had already left. Each day felt the same. I woke up early, I made breakfast, I helped the kids get ready, I walked them to school, then I took the bus to work. My feet hurt, my back hurt, but I kept going. At work, I smiled. I helped customers, I folded clothes, I cleaned the floor. No one knew how sad I felt inside. I didn't talk about my home. I didn't talk about Steve. I didn't talk about the pain. After work, I picked up the kids. We walked home. Grace told me about her class. Ellie showed me a picture she drew. Max talked about a new book. Leo just held my hand and smiled. Their little voices made me forget the hurt for a moment. When we got home, Steve was there, on the couch, watching TV. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how the kids were. He didn't look at me. The house felt cold. I cooked dinner. I gave the kids a bath. I helped with homework. I read them a story. Steve did nothing. He just watched TV and played on his phone. Every day was the same. One evening, Max dropped his plate. The food fell on the floor. Steve shouted, "Are you blind?" Max froze. I quickly said, "It's okay, it was an accident." Steve looked at me and said, "You're too soft. That's the problem." Then he left the room. Max looked at me, his eyes full of fear. I cleaned the mess and held him close. I whispered, "It's not your fault." But I could see that he didn't feel safe. That night, I sat by the window. I looked outside. The street was quiet. The moon was bright. I thought about running. I thought about packing bags and walking away. But where would we go? I had no answer. The next morning, I talked to Ellie while brushing her hair. She said, "Mom, do other dads smile?" I paused. Then I said, "Yes, some do." She said, "I wish Dad smiled more." I felt a tear in my eye, but I did not let it fall. At work, I asked my manager, "Can I work more hours?" He said, "We can try." I said, "I need to save some money." He looked at me and said, "Are you okay?" I smiled and said, "I'm just tired." He didn't ask more. I started working on weekends. I cleaned, folded, smiled, and stood on my feet all day. When I came home, my legs hurt, but I felt proud. I was trying to build a way out. Steve noticed. "Why are you working so much?" he asked. I said, "We need money." He replied, "You just want to stay away from me." I stayed quiet. One week, Leo got sick. He had a cough and a fever. I stayed up all night. I gave him medicine, I sang to him, I held him in my arms. Steve stayed in the other room. He did not help. He did not ask if Leo was okay. In the morning, I asked Steve, "Can you watch Leo for an hour so I can sleep?" He said, "I'm not a babysitter." Then he left the house. I sat on the floor and cried. I felt so tired, so small, so alone. A few days later, Grace came home with a school paper. She did well. I smiled and said, "I'm proud of you." She said, "Can you show Dad?" I walked to Steve and showed him the paper. He looked at it and said, "That's easy. I could do that with my eyes closed." Grace heard him. Her smile disappeared. That night, I held her hand and said, "You are smart. Don't let anyone tell you you're not." She said, "But Dad doesn't like us." I said, "That's not true." But I knew it was. I just didn't want her to know. Later that week, the school called. Ellie was in a fight. I went to the office. The teacher said she pushed another girl. I looked at Ellie. She looked down. I asked, "Why did you do that?" She said, "The girl said our house is loud and scary." I felt a pain in my chest. I knew the other kids could hear Steve shouting. I knew the kids at school could feel something was wrong. I said sorry to the teacher. I took Ellie home. I gave her a hug. She cried in my arms. I wanted to tell her we will leave soon, but I couldn't promise anything. Not yet. That weekend, I cleaned the house. Steve sat and watched. I asked him to move his feet so I could sweep. He said, "Do it later. I'm resting." I swept around him. He said, "You think you're better than me now?" I said, "No, I just want a clean home." He stood up. He looked at me. His eyes were angry. "Don't talk back to me," he said. I stepped back. My hand shook. I thought he might hit me, but he didn't. He walked away and slammed the door. The kids heard it. Leo started crying. I picked him up and held him close. That night, I sat at the kitchen table. I opened my purse. I counted the money I saved. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I thought, if I save for 3 more months, maybe I can rent a small place. I looked at the wall clock. It was past midnight. I was tired, but I felt something new. Hope. The next day, I told the kids, "Soon, things will be better." Max asked, "How?" I smiled and said, "You'll see." I didn't know the full plan yet, but I knew I could not stay much longer. Steve was not going to change, and I was done waiting. I went to bed that night with a small smile. I still had pain. I still had fear, but I also had a plan, and that made all the difference. I kept saving money. Every week, I put a little in my bag and hid it under the bed. I counted it each Sunday night. I didn't have enough yet, but I was getting close. I also looked at places to live. I walked by small houses after work. Some had signs that said, "For rent." I wrote down the numbers. One house was small but clean. It had 2 rooms and a small kitchen. It had no garden, but that didn't matter. I could see my children laughing there. I called the number one day after work. The woman on the phone was kind. She said the house was still free. I asked about the price. It was a little too high, but I said, "I will call back soon." I felt something in my heart that I had not felt for a long time: hope. At home, things got worse. Steve stopped talking to me. He did not say good morning. He did not say good night. He just sat and watched TV or slept. When the kids spoke to him, he told them to be quiet. They stopped trying. One day, Grace came to me and said, "Can I call you Mama again?" I smiled and said, "Of course." "Why did you stop?" She said, "Dad said not to call you that. He said you're just a house cleaner." My hands stopped moving. I was washing dishes. I looked at her and said, "You can always call me Mama. You are my daughter. That will never change." She hugged me tight. Steve was not just cruel to me. He was changing how the children felt too. They didn't laugh as much. They didn't run around. They walked slowly, talked quietly, and always looked at the door before they spoke. I knew it was time. That night, after the kids went to sleep, I took my bag of money and counted again. It was just enough. Maybe not for a full month, but enough to leave. I closed my eyes and said, "It's time." The next day, I went to see the woman with the house. I told her, "I want to take it." She looked at me kindly and said, "You can move in next week." I smiled, for real that day. When I came home, I didn't tell Steve. I didn't say anything. I just made dinner, helped with homework, and kissed each child goodnight. I looked at their faces as they slept. I whispered, "Soon, we will be safe." During the week, I packed slowly. I hid the clothes in bags under the bed. I put small toys in boxes and placed them in my closet. I told the children, "Soon we will go to a new house, but you must not tell Dad yet. It is a secret." They all nodded. They understood. The night before we left, I stayed awake. I looked around the small room. I had lived there for years. I had cooked, cleaned, cried, and hoped in that space. It was not easy to leave, but I had to. The next morning, Steve was still asleep. I woke up the kids early. We dressed fast. I picked up the bags and we walked out the door. I looked back once. I didn't feel sad. I felt strong. We got on a bus. We sat close. The kids were quiet, but Ellie smiled and said, "Is this our big day?" I said, "Yes, it is." We reached the house. The woman gave me the keys. I opened the door. The room was small. The walls were plain. But to me, it was beautiful. The kids ran inside. They looked at the empty space and said, "Can we sleep here tonight?" I said, "Yes, we live here now." They jumped and laughed. Max opened a window. Grace touched the walls. Leo sat on the floor and smiled. Ellie gave me a big hug and said, "Thank you, Mama." That night, we had no table, no chairs, no beds. We sat on the floor and ate bread with butter. But we were happy. For the first time in years, the room was full of peace. There was no shouting, no fear, no cold silence, just love. I did not sleep much that night, but I didn't cry. I listened to my children breathe. I watched them sleep. I closed my eyes and said, "We are free." The next day, I went to work as usual. My boss asked, "Are you okay?" I said, "Yes, I left my husband. I live alone with the kids now." He looked at me and said, "You are brave." I smiled and said, "I had to do it." Each day after that, life was not easy. The house was small. The food was simple. We had no sofa, no curtains, no toys. But we had smiles. We had hugs. We had sleep with no fear. Steve called one day. I didn't answer. He sent a message, "Come back." I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. One Sunday, I took the kids to the park. They ran on the grass, they laughed, they played with other children. I sat on the bench and watched. A woman sat beside me. She said, "Your children are happy." I said, "Yes, they are." She smiled and said, "You are doing something right." I looked at the sky and said, "I hope so." I still work every day. I still clean, cook, and walk a lot. My feet still hurt, but my heart is light. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, comment, and share. More emotional and inspiring stories are coming soon.